an incredible honor to be here at this amazing historical institution that's so important to New York City, and to be able to share the story of Leonor Fini, who I feel very passionate about. So the Museum of Sex was founded in 2002, so 16 years ago. I've been curating shows there since 2016, and it's really a wonderful place because sexuality itself is a very marginalized subject. It's a subject that is a part of everyone's life, whether you're asexual or extremely sexual. Everyone has a sexuality, and because of that, I actually get to explore a lot of subjects. I get to highlight artists that have been marginalized themselves. So it was really amazing to be able to put together the first ever U.S. museum show of Leonor Fini's work. How many people have heard of Fini before this? Oh, that's good. We have a good audience here. Generally, it's one or two hands. So all of you know how absurd it is that she hasn't had this show yet. So I'm extremely excited to share this with you. I hope you can make it to the exhibition. It's only on view through March 4th, and we've gathered works from all over the world. Many are going back into private collections, many sold into private collections during the duration of the show. So it's really important to see her paintings in person because their power vibrates and you could really feel it when you're there. And it's really great that it's at the Museum of Sex. It was, it was a big conversation when I approached the estate to do this show because she really should be in a larger institution. But Fini is larger than life, and at the Museum of Sex, she could completely dominate the space. She takes over the whole museum, so it ended up being perfect, and I couldn't ask for a better reception, and I couldn't ask for more than to be here tonight and share this with you. So here's a little preview. It's a spoiler if you haven't been there. So this is the first gallery, and this explores her work from the 30s through the 1960s. And then here is a great armoire. It was shown in Leo Castelli's first gallery. And this is the second floor that explores her work later in life. This is the second half of her career. You could see she wasn't afraid of change. There she is. So with Fini, her life and her art are so intertwined that you really have to talk about who she was, how she existed in the world, what her energy was like, what is her biography, because her art was herself, and every act had to do with some form of creative expression, some kind of exploration, experiment, a way to kind of like reach outside of everyday existence and see if she could touch something further. So she was born in Argentina in 1907, but she didn't live there very long. Her father was very violent, and her mother fled to Trieste, Italy. And he continued to abuse the family even from overseas. He would send kidnappers to try to abduct Fini when she was a little girl. So her mother would disguise her as a boy. And then being disguised as a boy, in the early teens, in the early part of the 20th century, she was able to feel what it was like to cross outside of her own gender and to cross outside of the identity that she was born with. So she was able to kind of transform, and she experienced metamorphosis early on, and this was very much a part of her identity throughout her career. And she also saw what her mother went through, and she became very sensitive to the rights of, for all genders. So here are some photos of her. I was very lucky to go through her private photo albums at the estate and get scans that have never been seen before. So she was an artist since she was like 5 years old. But she really became dedicated to painting when she was around 16. So she became blind for, I think it was 2 months, and she couldn't see anything. She had conjunctivitis for 2.5 months. And then afterwards, she had this incredible drive to paint, to record everything that she saw. She had visions during this period. And she was really lucky because Trieste was a very literary city at the time. So she had access to read, she could read in many different languages. So she had access to read like Freud before the other surrealists did, in German. She loved Nietzsche, she loved Jung. So she was reading a lot of books that made her see that there were ideas outside of what was being taught in school. So she was very rebellious and got kicked out of most schools. She was very mischievous. She loved to play. She loved to disguise herself. And because she really didn't like to conform to any school, she ended up teaching herself art, so she was self-taught. So she was actually connected to many of the greatest minds and celebrities of the 20th century and very well respected. She had very close friendships with so many different people. The list would just go on forever. But you can see her at the top with Federico Fellini, who she was dear friends with. She designed costumes for 8½. She was close friends with Salvador Dalí and Gala and helped them during World War II. She was friends with Max Ernst for decades, and he was one of her lovers, and she was very close friends with his subsequent lovers, Carrington and Tanning. Over here, she is with Brigitte Bardot on their way to a costume ball, and she was very well featured in the media. She was quite a celebrity, actually. She was a self-made woman. She didn't really come from a family that could support her lifestyle. So she went off at 21 to Milan for her first painting commission, and she had such a vibrant energy that she caught the eye of the art world right away in Italy. De Chirico championed her work. She didn't really enjoy the kind of fascism and misogyny that was happening in the art world in Milan at the time. So she took De Chirico's advice and moved to Paris in 1931. So she had her first solo exhibition in a gallery that was run by Christian Dior, who was actually a gallerist before he became known as a fashion designer. So her first exhibition, when she was 24 years old, featured themes that she would explore throughout her entire career. She lived until 1996. So right away, she's painting one of her lovers, Pierre Mondrian, in a feminine way. So this is named Transvestite with Bird. And she also painted women not conforming. So when she moved to Paris, they said that she needed to lose weight. So in return, she painted women indulging in sweets. So that's one of her favorite pastries from Trieste. And she also really wasn't interested in marriage or any notions of traditional roles that women were expected to play at the time. So here is her version of a wedding dress, which is quite revealing. So I'm going to move this little hand off. There we go. So being self-taught, she was traveling a lot to see art in person. And you can see here she doesn't really want to follow any rules that are assigned women, so she paints herself as Van Eyck. So she takes a self-portrait by a man, a very important self-portrait, and then she kind of like proclaims that she can do it too with this early piece. And she created her own life. So the photos here weren't really taken as like source material for her paintings. I'm just showing them here to show that she didn't just paint it, she lived it. And if she lived it, she painted it, vice versa. So here she is painting a new reality into existence. She's painting this owl into existence. And she also loved taxidermy, so she has this owl that she's playing with as a kind of performance in this series of photographs. So here she is. You can see her sense of playfulness. She loved dressing up. She loved transformation, metamorphosis. She didn't like being in any kind of box. And she invited people to get outside of their comfort zones and play games with them that were flirtatious, that were sexual, that expanded their idea of how they can behave or exist in the world or what their identity is. So she dressed up her entire life, as I said, so that's a very early snapshot where she's playing with a mask. And you'll see this theme throughout her life. And you could see that she used art as a creative act to build a world that didn't exist for women at the time. So she used art to create a world with her own set of rules. And this mirror that, her own mirror is kind of like a magical tool in which something that she wishes that she's putting out in the world, she becomes. So here's a great quote. Firstly, I paint mostly women because they are a projection of myself. That's a basic truth, because I am mostly interested in myself, and women are me. I think that that's pretty honest. I think most artists, or at least I'm an artist, and I feel like when it gets down to it, my art is coming from my own self-exploration. It's an investigation of myself and large questions about my own identity. So here she is in Argentine during World War II. She's taking the opportunity to paint outdoors in a corset with a headdress. And she also painted powerful feminine figures as well, wearing articles of her own clothing. So these kind of like, this bleeding over of living it and creating it was always happening. So the Sphinx was one of her favorite motifs. She loved mythology, and she loved the idea of this kind of like feminine hybrid of a cat and a woman, kind of having a riddle that these men have to like figure out to get access somewhere. She loved that idea. And she loved cats. She had up to 23 cats. She really loved cats. So you could see here is a photograph of Fini in a mask of her own design. And here, this isn't necessarily a self-portrait, but you can see that she is in this painting. So she was interested in the Sphinx since she was a little girl. So you could see that is actually a photo of her as a little girl. And then later in 1951, visiting Egypt. So she loved the idea of cats. She felt that they were the ultimate symbol of freedom to her, because cats are cats. They make their own rules. You don't really necessarily look at a cat and say oh, that's a male cat or that's a female cat, or you don't have any kind of preconceptions about cats, and they make their own rules. So she really identified. So like I said, she didn't go to art school. She didn't ever want to be categorized or be part of any kind of school of thought. She really didn't even like being in the Peggy Guggenheim show. She didn't like to be in an all-women show. She didn't like to be categorized as a woman or put into any box, although that might have, once in a while you kind of have to play along, but she was very fierce about that. So from the time she was really little, she would go to the morgue, and the the mortician, I guess, would, they knew her well and would show her the most beautiful dead bodies, and she would study them. That's how she learned how to paint the figures. She was self-taught. And she was not afraid of death. She wasn't afraid of anything, really. So she proudly wore skulls as headdresses and had them as decor, as you see in her apartment. So it was kind of like a form of power for her to be able to face mortality that way. Early on, when she moved to Paris, having such a successful show at Gallery Bongine run by Christian Dior, she met Max Ernst, she met all of the Surrealists. She was quickly included into the main shows on Surrealism. Here is her Fini at the Fantastic Art Dada and Surrealism exhibition at MoMA in 1936. So MoMA has 235 pieces by Max Ernst in their collection and 0 by Fini. So there's actually not many collections in the United States which hold her work. That's why it's so important to see the show. So you probably know about Julian Levy Gallery, the main gallery in New York to show Surrealist art and photography as well. They were the first to show Auger, Cartier-Bresson. They represented Salvador Dalí. So here's her exhibition catalog with the introduction by Paul Eluard and Giorgio de Chirico. So this exhibition, the International Surrealist Exhibition in London, I'm sure right away you recognize Man Ray, Max Ernst, all of the painters, and then there she is in the introduction of this show, 2 figurative paintings flanking the doors leading into Duchamp's installation. So here she is actually going over to New York the first time. 1936 was a big year for her, and Charles Henry Ford took this photograph of her. She was on the boat with Chelychev and Charles Henry Ford, and the newspapers covered her arrival in New York. So she was respected, and she arrived to the art scene established. She didn't need to be anyone's protege. And when she was treated as someone who should be seen and not heard in cafe discussions, it really did not rub well with her. So she refused to join the Surrealist group. She didn't enjoy the fact that André Breton, although as brilliant as he was and revolutionary, he created so many rules, and she would not follow rules. And she didn't really ever like homophobia or misogyny, so she refused. As a self-made woman, she supported herself by painting portraits. She preferred art that was more of the imagination, but she was good at painting portraits, so that was very lucrative for her. She did that on the side. She also designed this iconic bottle by for Schiaparelli, who this bottle went on to be copied by Jean-Paul Gaultier, and even Kim Kardashian's perfume bottle looks exactly like this now. So it was very influential. Schiaparelli would give her clothing to wear to parties because she loved wearing extravagant clothing, and she was always featured in the press. So Schiaparelli was next door to this space that opened up, and Leo Castelli, a friend from Fini's teenage years in Trieste, was thinking about becoming a gallerist. So Leo Castelli is one of the most well-known gallerists of the 20th century, had never put together a show. So she decided to help him and curate this exhibition on Surrealist furniture, the first ever exhibition of its kind. She had 3 pieces. It also included work by Marat Oppenheim, by Salvador Dalí, and here it's covered in Harper's Bazaar, American Harper's Bazaar, so it did well for Leo Castelli. And here's a fashion shoot of a Schiaparelli outfit by George I can't pronounce his last name, Hoinen Hune. I know his work, but one of the most important fashion photographers of the 1930s. So instead of kind of integrating herself with Breton, who didn't really fully accept women as equals, she aligned herself with Jean Genet, with Georges Bataille, with Jean Cocteau. She preferred to be around homosexual men because I feel like she didn't quite fit into her own gender. She preferred to identify as androgynous because she liked that in-between space where there was no expectation for her to play the traditional role of a woman. So I think she really identified with Genet, and she was very open about her exploration of sexuality, something that she shared with Genet. So here she illustrated a book of poems by him. She designed costumes for many of his plays. So he was looking at homoerotic subject matter at crime during a time when to be gay was illegal, sodomy was illegal, to publish this kind of work was illegal. So she was, she was really radical. So she was given the opportunity to illustrate a work by Marquis de Sade. She chose Juliet, which you may or might not know is the counterpart to another character that he dedicated a book to, Justine. Justine worked very hard to be virtuous against a world that was very libertine, and she was punished for all of her attempts to be moral. And in the book Juliet, she was rewarded for all of her immoral actions, and she got to do whatever she wanted and explore every kind of transgression. So Fini was very happy to explore every kind of transgression in this book. So Juliet was a banned book at the time, and I was told that this edition was secretly printed on the presses of the Vatican in 1944. Which her life plays out like a von Sternberg film featuring Marlene Dietrich, so any kind of adventure is possible with her. So she was always in open relationships. So Mondrian was someone she was in a relationship with for many, many years. He was a writer. But you can see just how playful she was and the adventure your life would become if you were invited into her circle, but you did have to play by her rules. One of the most extraordinary things that really shook me when I was revisiting her work and thinking about doing this show was the way that she painted men. So I curated a show called Not Safe for Work, Female Gaze with Vice, and I was hard-pressed to find women who were painting erotic nudes of men. And here she is in 1942. She found this young man, Nico Papatakis, and he was her ideal. And she also, shared him with Jean Genet, who dedicated La Galère, the past illustration, to him. They called him a Greco-Ethiopian god, and he posed for several of her works. He actually went on to date Nico of the Velvet Underground, and that's where she got her name from. So that's kind of interesting. And Chantamour, Jean Genet's film, was also produced by Nico. Here she is. This isn't considered a self-portrait, but she's very much here. And this man is actually modeled after one of her favorite lovers. So she really wanted men to be able to experience like this space that was typically relegated to women as the muse. And she wanted them to be able to feel beautiful or vulnerable and show that that was desirable to her. I think a lot of it probably came from her, I mean, she was very interested in Freud, so her kind of analyzing her own life and the violence that, that tormented her family early on. So I think that she really, and this was painted during World War II, when, a male-dominated culture was destroying the world, literally. So it was really important that here she is painting, referencing all of art history and making this very bold statement at a time that feels just so fresh still today and so radical. So I found this little snapshot that I have up here to the right. So there is Nico in a painting called The Alcove, but when I looked through her album of snapshots, her bed was in an alcove, and it was quite a theater in itself. So here she is in her own bed. So she is making her own desires and fantasies come to life through her work. This here, a sphinx, she's been transformed again into one of her favorite archetypes, this feminine figure, which may or may not be her, but is a part of her. All of the paintings are. So here, Julian Levy, the great gallerist, is talking about what it was like to go over to her room. And here she is kind of performing. So it was kind of confusing. I included a lot of photographs of her to identify which photographer actually photographed each picture, because she was always inviting people over to photograph her in her apartment with these theater curtains. So hence the title Theater of Desire for the exhibition. So some that were originally attributed to Dora Maar were by someone else, and it was kind of a little bit of a detective work to sort that out. Here are some early watercolors that really show her interest in the idea of the double of a self that can twin and multiply. So in the 1940s, she started to be commissioned to do costume designs, which she did for Balanchine. She was commissioned to do work for Albert Camus, even for Jean Genet, for Roland Petit. She did costumes for filmmakers as well, John Huston. So here you can see that she's taking some of her ideas and she's adding another dimension by having professional dancers perform her fantasies. So here are some photographs by the great photographer Brisai of the Ladies of the Night. So she really, a lot of the surrealists really love kind of like poking at religion and hypocrisy. So she was always keen to joyfully explore blasphemy in her work. And she also wore cardinal stockings, which really impressed Breton when she met him. She showed up in a cafe wearing a robe and little else underneath with cardinal stockings. Here are some of her later costume designs for Jean Genet. This is a play, set in a brothel, and there is a revolution happening, and the madam of the brothel ends up the queen in the end. It's a really incredible work about identity and power and sexuality. So after the war, costume balls became a thing. She was the best at costume balls. She disliked being the best at costume balls. She really didn't care for people. She was a little antisocial. So she would kind of show up just to kind of to be this new thing that she created, this new being, and to live it and to breathe it and to be photographed so there is evidence that this new thing she created existed, that she brought it into the world. Over here is Life magazine in the United States covering her in 1948. These are other costume ball images. She hired André Astier to photograph her every year. She went to a ball. Sometimes there were several balls in a year. She was quoted as saying she pities whoever asks her to dance. She's just there to look at herself in the mirror. And mansions happen to have the best mirrors, So that was her favorite part of it. You can, I mean, you could curate an entire exhibition of photographs of Leonor Fini. She loved to be photographed. As you see, she didn't really like it at first, but then she realized that she was kind of creating an extension, like I said, bringing life to all of these different characters, all of these different identities, and experiencing like this ultimate freedom. So when she had a photographer such as Blumenfeld, who is on par with Irving Penn in terms of the history of fashion photography, early in his career, invited to the alcove, she really was directing the photo shoots in many ways. So this photograph by Cartier-Bresson was very early in his career. She was showing him Italian art and going to meet her mother. They were friends together with Mondrian, and this is from a beautiful day. This was captured in the history of photography. It has gotten one of the highest auction records ever. It set a record at one point. In 1936, George Platt Lines. This photograph is sometimes attributed to Dora Maar. This is Fini with Carrington. She was very close to Max Ernst and understood that, an idea of an open relationship and open sexuality. So she had no problem with embracing his other partners later on. So here's Carl Van Vechten. So she was interested in witchcraft. She was most drawn to Michelet's interpretation of sorcery and witchcraft, in which witches weren't ugly old women, in the worst sense. They were women who were powerful and wanted to overthrow feudal order. So she loved that interpretation. Here is a book of illustrations, so you could see her wonderful line work, and she became a voracious lover of, she was always a voracious reader, and you'll see later on her prolific output of illustrations in artist books. Everyone knew her as really good at doing witches, so Roland Petit invited her to come up with this idea for a witches' Sabbath, for this insane musical that never really got fully funded. It was like insane. So Yves Saint Laurent was a part of it. Serge Gainsbourg was doing the music. It was like really crazy. She was gonna have everyone dance on their hands the entire time with faces painted on their butts, which is, I really was so excited when I saw this and showing everyone in the office, because I'm pretty immature. She had two primary partners. So Stanislaw Lepri was one of her primary partners. They were together for 40 years, both of them. So here is Kat and Stanislaw. So as you see here, marriage didn't really appeal to her. But at the same time, it didn't mean she couldn't be in a lifelong relationship with somebody, or two people, which happened to be Stanislaw and Kat. So Stanislaw was an Italian diplomat. He was born into it, and it really wasn't a good time to be in an Italian government in the 1940s, as I said. So she was like, you were born into this. I know that you don't really like it. You're a painter. And she became much of like a major mentor to him, and he left. And here is a painting. The painting on the left is a painting she had in her bedroom and never exhibited her entire life. So it's just gorgeous. It's full of deep symbolism, and it's so sensitive, and it really shows beauty that that masculinity can be very beautiful and very sensitive. And here she is with Kat. So Kat was 30 and she was 45 when they began their relationship. So he was very important writer in Poland who introduced Polish literature to Western Europe. And it was really a big deal, like, when he left, because he was mostly in a queer circle, and she was like, they're like, oh my God, like, his mother was like, I'd rather you be with any man than to leave for this older woman who's so domineering. But he went off and was happy, and Stanislaw, Kot, and Leonor were all buried together. Here is Leonor and Stanislaw in Monte Carlo. They found a beautiful younger man, so they're kind of like having fun, finding beauty in nature. And here they are later on. There's Kot and Stanislaw at her summer home with Max Ernst and Dorothea Tanning. So here's back to her interest in death. So this Angel of Anatomy was actually inspired by an engraving done by Diagotti from the 18th century. And originally it was of a woman with her back turned, showing her flayed back, with her face in profile, kind of like her body completely open and exposed to the gaze of the viewer. So she's turning the body around and creating a figure that's much more androgynous. And the figure here is being very active and aggressive in the way that they're exposing themselves. They're not a passive figure within this work as the original was. Georges Bataille actually used this as one of his engravings in The Tears of Eros, which was a book that explored eroticism in death. So the portrait of Mrs. H, so this is an example of one of her portraits that she did on commission, but was not accepted by the sitter. It wasn't quite flattering to the sitter, but it pleased Fini, so she was happy to keep it. Over here, she loved bones. So this is a very phallic-looking bone that has a lot of personality. I really like it. And then, so during World War II, she was kind of trying to escape places that were being occupied by Nazis the best she could, and taking her mother. It was really hard, actually, to be able to escape to America. She wanted to. I mean, she had like dozens of cats, literally, and she really cared very deeply about her mother. She was the center of her mother's world. So she was, and she's a good Italian girl in a lot of ways. She really was, so she wasn't going to leave her mother and go. So she was kind of finding these different places to escape the war. And at one point, she did have to stop back into Rome briefly. It happened to be the day that like Mussolini fell, and there was like bombs going off around the windows of the train when the train was arriving. So she and Stanislaw escaped to this island called Giglio. And then when she got there, of course, there was like an insane storm, and all of this kind of like bone and plant and animal matter washed up onto the shore, and it was a symbol of hope for her to kind of see this regeneration during a time that was so tragic, and there wasn't really a sense of what was going to happen in the world. It was very uncertain. So her style of painting changed. This is in the 1950s, a little later, but it became more abstract. It became more metaphysical. It became, everything looked like kind of fragmented and underwater. It was called her mineralogique period. So here she's not afraid to face things that are dark. You could see how she never stopped pushing the way that she painted. She, was everything. She got to embrace her beauty. She got to be part of society, design clothes, do everything. And then she was just so serious as a painter. And she painted for, hours every day, like always taking risks. So at this point, in the 1960s, like she goes from this very realistic style and she just blows it up entirely, and it becomes so visceral. And then afterwards, it becomes so different. So she wasn't afraid to change, and she didn't care if she was identified with one style and then tried another. So this painting is actually really huge. It's like the size of 3 or 4 of these paintings here. And the paintings before that were smaller than one of these paintings, maybe like one of the smaller paintings over on this wall. So this is huge. The paint, her technique was very thin, translucent layers. The paintings almost glow, they're iridescent. So this next section really starts around 1967. And she was 60 years old in 1967, and she took the opportunity to explore sexuality with even more intensity and eroticism. So it was also the Summer of Love, 1968. So she was right there at the forefront, kind of exploring these ideas of gender and feminine sexuality and freedom. So Hurry, 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 My Dolls Are Waiting, Rush, 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 is a painting that's very biographical. So she was, here she is around 5 years old with her German mistress, and she is kind of scolding her, her nanny for kind of interrupting her fantasy. And then all of these figures are like fragmented aspects of all these different people she was able to become through her own force of creativity. She loved to explore her own fantasies. She always fantasized when she was on trains about what it would be like to have an erotic encounter with a fellow passenger. So she did a series of paintings about trains that included various sexual acts. The top painting is wonderfully ambiguous. You don't know if they're killing each other, or if they're man or woman or anything. It's just a fabulous painting, and you really have to see it in person. She really liked exploring the idea of like teaching, of mentorship, of kind of like examining. She did a whole series of drawings about examining bodies. So there is something very playful about her kind of like looking back at her old self as a mature woman and kind of like enjoying that in a lot of ways. In 1984, she was in her late 70s, and here she is kind of making this really incredible statement of these other women in the back. They have shackles around their necks, and they're completely covered up. But then the woman next to them has kind of defeated the shackles and put her foot firmly down on them, and she's expressing her freedom in a way that's very intentional and direct. At the top is this great painting about voyeurism, and there are these really beautiful, subtle, kind of ghostly nudes painted on the walls. She loved mythology, and she also created her own. Rogomolek was a subject of a book that she actually wrote herself. And you could see here the pearl, which is a euphemism for the clitoris in the bathers. So she illustrated over 50 artist books. So these books are like this big, and they're bound in the most beautiful paper. And the illustrations are all loose prints. Many of them she signed individually. And it was an opportunity for her to bring her love of literature into the forefront and to also show her own lineage in art history, connecting herself to people who explored eroticism, who explored taboo, who explored queerness. She was able to bring all of these stories out and show her intense love for them, and lived, through these illustrations, like lived her passion through the form of a book. So Satyricon, she worked on at the same time as Fellini. They got the idea to do it. They were both interested, And there's a really beautiful video in the INA database of both of them sharing their work, and she's like, oh, it's not as good as a movie. Movies are so much better. And Julieta Messina is like, no, your book is so beautiful. And they're getting very emotional. Fellini was like one of the only people who she would like make sure her cats weren't around, like when he came over because he was allergic to fur. Other than that, like if you even like pushed a cat off your lap, you were just like banned for life with her. But she made an exception. She loved Fellini. So here you see an illustration for the story of O, which was a later work that was written in the 50s, which was different for her because it was about exploring the submissive role, but she ended up illustrating it because actually the character in the finale of that book was inspired by her. So here is the character wearing an owl mask, which is a part of the finale of the book, and she illustrated an edition. Over here is Monsieur Venus, which was written by Rothschild, which was a pseudonym for Marguerite Emerald, which was written in the late 1870s about an aristocratic woman who catches, her fancy on this younger man who is creating flowers for a dress she wants to have made. She thinks that he's beautiful, so she, of course, goes home and she creates a place to lock him up in to keep him as a sex slave. And it's all covered in velvet, and he's never seen like such beautiful material before. And then he's like sucking on the tassels. He's like, oh my God, tassels. And like, I feel the same way about tassels. I love tassels. They're so fun. And then eventually, he's like locked in there, and then she spoils him so that he could never integrate back in society. And she turns him into her wife, and it ends bad because it was the 19th century and they didn't know how to end that good back then. Here's La Fanfarlo, Baudelaire. You can see how amazing her line work is. So she would paint for like hours every morning. She would draw and draw and draw. Alongside of her wonderful body of work, there's just stacks of these wonderful drawings. Here's one of the examinations. Here's the marvels of nature, the Council of Love. These are studies for these would later become costumes for the play. And also she illustrated a book. Here is the stag. So she was having an affair with a man at the time that she nicknamed the stag. So this is a little study of it. This is like one of the, I think Cott got jealous of him or something, so it was a little unusual. Some more beautiful drawings. Here's Orpheus. After the Maenads had their way with him, they were pretty much done with him. They're like, ew. So here is this kind of like, I was talking to Richard Overstreet, who manages her estate. He was actually one of, someone in her close circle, one of her lovers, and everyone who knew her has, she's still living through them, like her rules, the way she wanted to be presented, like they're very devoted to her still. Like her power is still existing. You know that her voice is in the back of their heads. I asked Richard, I was like, what always gets missed in a show about Fini? And he was like, her sense of humor. She was so funny to people she allowed to get close to her. So he showed me all these drawings that she did for him to cheer him up that were all about vomiting. They were really funny. This one's about caca, so I included that in the wall of drawings for people who like that sort of thing. It's a museum of sex where, do your thing. So here's one of the capes that she wore later in life. So she bought a dilapidated monastery that had once been taken over by pirates in Corsica. And she would go there for months every summer where she could, wear capes or wear nothing at all and be creative. And every August 30th, she had a costume ball where everyone would wear costumes that she prepared for them, like over the course of the year, and she would have special garments made for herself and headdresses. So we have one on view at the museum that came from the closet of her studio, which was kind of wonderful. Like, I was like, "Are there any costumes left?" And Richard was like, "Oh yeah, here." And he like pulled out these suitcases of capes, and I was like, "Oh my God." He was like, "Try it on to see how it works." And I was like, "Okay." So this is Corsica. There's there's some beautiful films in the museum, but I don't know how to make that work with a PowerPoint. But so anyways, there's color film versions of all of this, and she's like levitating in the monastery. She's just hanging out. There's no one else there. It's really just for her friends and close people close to her, close friends. You could see how creative it was. These are all snapshots. Some of these were done these are done professionally and shared, but this really just shows how fun it was to be around her and how, everything that she did was a creative act. Like she found masks and rocks on the beach, old pieces of wood. She would take seaweed and put it on her face. So she was, you were just like immersed in the sense of freedom and possibility. And she really had to keep close friends because she really didn't like kind of being outside of a space, in a space where they were going to tell her that no, like this life that you've created for yourself isn't appropriate for a woman, or isn't, your ideas about androgyny or sexuality or freedom, like I'm going to inhibit you or I'm going to put you down. So she stayed with people who really got her. And in turn, she was able to allow them like a sense of freedom that I think a lot of men couldn't really experience as well in society at that time. Like the freedom to be her horse while she gallops around Corsica. Here's a dinner party. So these are some beautiful portraits by Richard, who, they're very special. So the people who she touched really feel deeply moved by her. And working on this show was very deeply moving to, actually most of the staff at the museum and the curatorial side, some very special people are here tonight, Heather and Inesh. So they were kind of immersed in this story as well. And she became this like very empowering person to learn about. And it felt like truly an adventure to be able to experience a bit of her life, even just through reading it. She lived so radically that I can't even imagine being brave enough to do what she did today. So I'm really, really so happy that people saw this show and I could put this story out into the world because she was completely integrated into culture during her lifetime, and it really is unfortunate that after she passed away that her name faded away, especially in the United States. So hopefully we can change that, so spread the word, like make everyone a Fini fan. But that's it for this presentation.